My name is Lucas Turner, 32 years old, a geologist, and currently residing in Denver, Colorado. If you ask me where I'm from, I'll say the small town of Meadowbrook, a place hidden amidst the vast prairies of Kansas. But if you ask where I truly belong, I'll pause, because the answer is not as clear-cut as it seems. I've spent my life searching for a place that could offer peace, far from the sound of angry shouts or the heavy scent of cheap whiskey. Today, as I sit here in my comfortable home, I want to tell you the story of how a boy who grew up in chaos learned to find light in the darkness. Meadowbrook wasn't the kind of place that made it onto travel brochures. It was small, dusty, and quiet in a way that felt like the silence before a thunderstorm. A few dilapidated streets, a single diner that had seen better days, and an old bar that seemed to attract the same few patrons every day. My family lived on the outskirts of town, a weathered two-story house with peeling paint and windows that were always kept tightly shut, hiding the secrets inside. My father, James Turner, was a mechanic, but he spent more time drinking than actually working. My mother, Linda, had been a cashier before I was born but gave it up when I was 5, saying she didn't need the job anymore. Both of them were alcoholics, and the liquor made them laugh, cry, fight, or worse, turn on me and my siblings. I was the eldest, born when my parents were still young, and at one time, they had dreams of a better life. But those dreams quickly faded as the years passed, and the alcohol took over. I had 2 younger brothers, Ethan, who was 10 years younger than me, and Max, the youngest, just 2 years old, when I realized our family wasn't like the ones in storybooks. I loved them more than anything, and I did everything I could to protect them, even if it meant taking on more pain myself. My childhood was devoid of joy. It was filled with sleepless nights, curled up in bed, listening to the sound of breaking bottles, and my mother screaming as my father lost yet another bet at the local bar. I remember the first time I realized I was different. I was 7 years old, and my teacher, Mrs. Lawson, kept me after class one day. She was concerned about the bruise on my arm. "Lucas," she asked gently, "are you okay? That bruise looks bad." I lied, of course. "I fell down playing ball," I said. Mrs. Lawson didn't believe me, but she didn't press further. Even then, at such a young age, I knew that no one could save me from the nightmare I was living in. My father wasn't always cruel, though. On the rare occasions when he was sober, he'd sit on the porch steps and talk about our ancestors, hard-working farmers who survived the harshest of times. "Turner blood runs strong," he'd say, with a rare gleam of pride in his eyes. I cherished those moments because they made me feel like he was still a father. But all it took was one drink, and that father would disappear, replaced by a stranger whose fists were faster than his words. As for my mother, she didn't hit me, but her indifference hurt even more. When I was 10, I brought home a drawing that my teacher had praised. I thought she'd be proud, but she barely looked at it and muttered something about no space for nonsense. I stood there, holding that drawing, feeling like my heart was being crushed, but I refused to let their neglect destroy me. I found solace in books. The town library, a small building with the scent of old paper, became my sanctuary. I read everything I could find: adventure stories, history books, and eventually, I discovered geology. The idea that the Earth, though scarred and old, could hold secrets beneath its surface fascinated me. Maybe, I thought, I was like the Earth, wounded on the outside, but with something valuable inside. As the oldest, I learned to be the shield for my younger brothers. When my father would get angry, I'd pull Ethan and Max into my room, lock the door, and tell them stories to drown out the shouting. One day, I promised them, "We'll leave this place. We'll have a house with a lawn, windows open, and we'll all be safe." Ethan would nod, eyes full of hope, and Max, barely understanding, would hold on to me as if afraid I would disappear. I believed it. I had to believe it, because without that hope, I didn't know how I would survive. But when I was 15, things took a turn for the worse. My father lost his job as a mechanic after a drunken outburst with his boss, and the beatings became more frequent. One night, I tried to stop him from hitting Ethan for breaking a glass. He shoved me to the floor. I remember the cold wood against my back and the pounding of my heart as I looked up at the wild fury in my father's eyes. But just as he raised his hand, he stopped and stumbled out of the house. I lay there, breathing heavily, while Ethan ran to me, sobbing. That night, as I comforted him, I realized I needed a plan. I started working after school, delivering newspapers and cleaning at the grocery store on weekends. I hid the money I earned in an old tin box buried under a tree in the backyard. It wasn't just money, it was a promise to my brothers that we would escape this place. By the time I turned 18, I had a full scholarship to study geology at the University of Colorado in Boulder. It was my ticket out of Meadowbrook, but when I told my parents, my mother gave a faint smile, and my father said, "Don't think you're better than us just because you're going to college." I didn't argue. I packed my things, hugged Ethan and Max, and left. As the bus took me away from the only home I had ever known, I looked back once, but my heart felt heavy, not because I was leaving them, but because I was leaving behind a part of myself, the boy who still hoped for a real family. Boulder, Colorado, was a far cry from Meadowbrook. The first thing I noticed as I stepped off the bus was the air clean, crisp, and full of possibility. No more dust, no more dead, stale air that seemed to stick to everything in my old town. The streets were lined with tall trees that offered shade and beauty, and the buildings, although old, had a charm that I had never seen before. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was stepping into something that wasn't just a place, but a future. The University of Colorado stood in front of me like a massive fortress of knowledge. The red brick buildings stretched tall, and the students walking around with their books in hand didn't seem to notice the world around them, lost in their own thoughts and dreams. I felt like an outsider, a small-town boy who had no business being in such a place. But I had a scholarship, I had an opportunity, and I wasn't going to let anything, not even the feeling of not belonging, hold me back. My dorm room was small, just enough space for a bed, a desk, and a small window that looked out onto the bustling campus. It was a stark contrast to the broken-down house in Meadowbrook, but the emptiness inside me was still there. I could still hear the shouts, the broken bottles, and my mother's cold eyes staring at me. But I pushed all of that away, focusing instead on the textbooks piled up beside my bed. Geology became my obsession. Every class, every lecture was a chance to escape, to study the earth, how rocks, mountains, and minerals told stories about time, about life, about everything that had come before me. I loved it, not just because of the subject itself, but because it gave me a sense of control. It was a field where I could find answers, where the mysteries were hidden in plain sight if you just knew how to look. But no matter how much I tried to drown out the pain, the memories, I couldn't escape it. One evening, after a long day of lectures, I walked back to my dorm feeling the weight of the past press down on me. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the air around me as students strolled in groups. But I felt like I was moving in slow motion, detached from it all. When I returned to my room, I took out my phone. There were no new messages, nothing from my parents or my brothers. The silence from them was suffocating, and yet it also felt like a relief. But I couldn't shake the guilt. I had left them behind, Ethan, Max, and the guilt gnawed at me. I knew I couldn't change my parents, and I didn't want to. But I also couldn't forget that they were still there, stuck in their own cycles of destruction. I thought of Ethan and Max, of their futures that seemed so bleak in that town, with no chance to escape, just like I once felt. But for now, all I could do was study. I buried myself in my work, in my geology books, in the lectures. The earth, with all its faults, its imperfections, seemed like the only thing I could rely on. It made sense. It had history. It was a constant, unlike everything in my past. One afternoon, I met Sarah. She was standing behind the counter at the campus library, her brown hair tied up in a loose bun, her blue eyes sparkling with curiosity. She handed me the book I had requested with a friendly smile, and for the first time in months, I felt a spark of something I hadn't known was missing. "You like rocks?" she asked, glancing at the book I was holding. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. It wasn't just rocks to me. They were my escape, my only way to see the world beyond the misery of my childhood. "Yeah," I said. "I used to think they were just rocks, but then I saw a piece of quartz once, and it felt magical." Sarah laughed, her voice light and full of warmth. "That sounds amazing," she said, looking genuinely interested. "You must know a lot about them." For the first time, someone didn't just see me as the boy from Meadowbrook. She saw me, as Lucas, a guy who had dreams and passions. We began to talk more, and over time, Sarah became my friend. She was kind, curious, and passionate about everything she did. We went on hikes in the nearby foothills, exploring the rock formations, and she would ask me questions about the geology of the area. I loved answering her questions, seeing the excitement in her eyes as I shared my knowledge. But as much as I tried to focus on school and Sarah, the old wounds never fully healed. I stayed in touch with my brothers, sending money when I could, but it always felt like a band-aid over a gaping wound. I wrote letters to them, telling them about the mountains, about the new rocks I'd discovered, and how I was doing. Ethan wrote back, but Max, who was only 12, sent me drawings, pictures of houses, pictures of happy families, things I could never give them. In my quiet moments, I wondered if I was doing enough, if this life was the one I wanted. I had escaped the hell that was my childhood, but I couldn't escape the guilt. The day I received a letter from Max, with a picture of a house he drew for me, I knew I had to do something more. I had to get them out of that town. But first, I had to focus on my future. I graduated with honors at 23, and with Sarah by my side, I started working at a mineral exploration company in Denver. It wasn't a high-paying job, but it was a start. We found an apartment together, and life slowly began to feel like it could be more than just surviving. As much as things were improving, the past still lingered like a shadow. I didn't want Sarah to meet my parents. I didn't want her to see the broken house or hear the endless shouting. But one day, she insisted. She wanted to meet the people who had shaped me, who had made me who I was, for better or worse. I agreed, though my stomach twisted at the thought of returning to the place that had held me captive for so long. When we arrived, my father was drunk, sitting in his usual armchair with a bottle in hand. My mother, as always, had an expression that bordered between indifference and disdain. Declan was there, now 15, and Max was sitting in the corner, his eyes cold, as if blaming me for leaving them behind. Sarah tried to make conversation, but the air was thick with tension, and I wanted to pull her out of there as quickly as possible. The drive back to Denver was silent. Sarah didn't say much, but I could feel the sadness in her eyes. She had seen the truth, and it wasn't the one I had hoped to protect her from. When we got home, I apologized, but she just held my hand and reassured me. "You don't have to apologize for them," she said softly. "You've done so much better than they ever did." That night, I realized that it was time to move forward, not just for me, but for Sarah, for my brothers, and for the life I had fought so hard to build. The days following the visit to my parents' house were strange. A part of me felt lighter, as if some of the weight I had carried for years had been lifted, but another part of me was still sinking into the past. The memories of my childhood, the years spent trying to survive in a home filled with darkness and neglect, never truly let go. Sarah was incredible, as she always was, her gentle nature making it easier for me to cope with the constant tug-of-war in my heart. But there were times when I would catch her looking at me with those deep blue eyes, searching for something I couldn't always find within myself. I wasn't sure if it was a question, an expectation, or just the weight of everything I hadn't yet said, but it felt like the hardest part of our relationship was still to come. I had built this wall around me, and though she tried to gently chip away at it, I wasn't ready to tear it down. Not yet. The phone calls from my parents continued. They had started to sound less demanding, more desperate. My father's voice was often slurred, asking for money for bills or food, and each time I listened, my resolve strengthened. No matter what, I couldn't let them drag me back into the hole I had barely escaped. One particular call hit me harder than the others. My father's voice was more urgent than I'd ever heard it. "Kieran, you've got to come back home. It's serious. You need to come and talk to us. We need you." The last thing I wanted was to return to that suffocating place, but something in his tone made me hesitate. It wasn't the typical demand for money, or at least it didn't sound like it. Something was different this time. Against my better judgment, I told Sarah that I was going back. She didn't argue. She simply held me, kissed my cheek, and said, "You don't owe them anything, but if you feel you need to go, I'll be here when you get back." Driving through the familiar winding roads that led me to Meadowbrook was like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The town hadn't changed. It still looked just as run down and forgotten as I remembered. The streets were cracked and littered with the remnants of a forgotten past. Houses standing in various stages of decay, each one a silent reminder of the people I had left behind. When I arrived at the house, I found my father sitting in his usual chair, his face more gaunt than I remembered, his eyes bloodshot and tired. My mother was standing in the corner, her arms crossed, staring at the floor as though she had been waiting for this moment for years. "Sit down," my father growled, waving vaguely to the empty chair across from him. His tone was much more serious than I had expected. The whiskey bottle sat on the table beside him, untouched for once. I took a seat, my chest tight with anticipation. I wasn't sure what he wanted, but I could sense that it wasn't going to be good. "Look, Kieran," he began, his voice hoarse. "I know things haven't been great between us, but I've got a proposition for you, and I'm not going to could change everything." Patrick O'Connell, you remember him? He's got a daughter, Nora. She's different now, paralyzed from the waist down from a car accident a few years ago. She needs a husband, and I think you're the perfect guy for the job. The words hit me like a slap across the face. My heart began to race. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger. "I'm not marrying anyone. I have a life now. I have Sarah. I don't want anything to do with this. My father leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Don't be foolish. Patrick's offering $500,000 for this. You can turn this family's life around. You could fix everything, Kieran. Don't tell me you don't want that for your brothers. He wasn't just talking about money. He was offering me a way out, a chance to end the misery, to finally give my brothers a shot at something better. But it wasn't real. It was just another manipulation, another chain around my neck. I'm not doing it, I said, standing up, shaking with rage. I love Sarah, and I'm not selling myself, not to Patrick O'Connell, not to you. I turned to my mother, hoping for some support, some acknowledgement that I wasn't the only one who felt trapped. But she simply stared at the floor, her silence speaking volumes. I can't believe you'd even ask this of me, I said, my voice shaking. You've already taken everything I had, but I won't let you take this too. Not anymore. My father scoffed, his face twisted with disgust. You think you're better than us now? You think that degree you've got, that job, it makes you better than your family? You wouldn't be anything without me? I felt the old anger rise inside me, a familiar fury that burned just as hot as it had when I was younger. I don't owe you anything, not anymore, and I'm not going to let you use me to fix your mistakes. Declan appeared in the doorway, his face tight with fear. Kieran, don't listen to them. You don't have to do this. Please, don't do it. I reached for him, my heart breaking for him, but my father stepped in, his voice rising. Shut up, Declan. This doesn't concern you. It was the last straw. My father had never understood. He had never cared. And my mother, she had just become a silent bystander to it all. I'm done, I said, my voice low but resolute. This family is not my family anymore. You're not my family. You haven't been for a long time. The words stung, but they were true. I walked out of that house, not looking back. As I drove back to Boulder, my mind was in turmoil. I hadn't just walked away from my parents. I had finally, truly walked away from my past. And I had left them behind, not out of hate, but because I could no longer carry their burden. When I arrived back at Sarah's apartment, I felt both numb and liberated. Sarah was there, waiting for me. And when she saw me, she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She just held me, her warmth a beacon in the storm I had just weathered. It's over, I whispered to her, the words feeling strange but right. I'm free. The days after my confrontation with my parents were strange. I was at once relieved and burdened, free from the past, but still haunted by the shadows it had cast on me. I had done what I needed to do, but there was no guarantee that walking away from that world would bring peace. It had taken me a long time to get to this point, to make the decision to sever ties, and though I stood tall in my choice, I felt the weight of the years, the lost time, and the dreams I'd tried to protect. Sarah was a constant presence during those days, offering her quiet strength, the one thing I never had growing up. She made the quiet moments easier, but the loud moments, the ones when I would still hear my father's voice in my head or feel the weight of my mother's indifference, those were harder to shake off. The silence between us, as comfortable as it could be, didn't last long. I still had my career and the world that I had been trying to build. The promise I'd made to Declan and Liam to get them out of the nightmare we had grown up in lingered in my mind. The morning after I had returned from my parents' house, Sarah suggested we take a weekend trip to the mountains. You've been through a lot, she said gently. We can just go and breathe, leave all the noise behind for a while. You need it. I agreed. The thought of standing in the Rockies, surrounded by nature, had always given me a sense of peace. It was a reminder that life was bigger than any of the struggles I had faced. It was a reminder that there was always room to grow, always a place for me to heal. We packed our things and drove north, away from the city. As we ascended into the foothills of the mountains, the landscape grew quieter, more expansive. The highway thinned, the trees thickened, and the world began to feel like it was getting smaller, simpler, in a good way. It was just us, the road, and the towering peaks that loomed above us, silent and steady. The small cabin we rented was tucked away on the edge of a pristine lake, its waters still like glass. We arrived just as the sun began to set, the sky a brilliant cascade of pinks and purples. Sarah, ever the optimist, immediately pulled out her camera and snapped a few pictures of the lake. You need to remember this moment, Kieran, she said. Remember that it's not about how far you've come, but how you choose to live now. Her words made me pause. It had been so easy to get lost in what had happened, to keep dragging the past behind me like an anchor. But Sarah was right. I was no longer the boy from Havenfield. I had a life to build, and that life wasn't defined by the mistakes of others or even my own past. The evening passed slowly, with the two of us sitting outside by the fire, The crackling of the wood in the quiet air, the scent of pine trees lingering in the breeze. It was a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. For once, I didn't feel like I had to watch my back. There were no secrets, no lies, no voices from the past chasing me. It was just Sarah and me, in this beautiful moment that felt timeless. As we sat there, she turned to me. Kieran, I know what you've been through, but I also know you're capable of more than you think. You're not just surviving anymore. You're living, and you deserve to have the life you've always dreamed of. I looked at her, the firelight dancing in her eyes, and I knew she was right. This was the life I had fought for. And though the past would always be a part of me, it didn't have to control my future. Over the next few days, we hiked through the mountains, talked late into the night, and shared the kind of intimate moments that made me realize how much Sarah had helped me become the person I was. She never judged me, never expected anything other than the truth, and it made all the difference. She had a way of helping me see that everything I had fought for wasn't just for survival, it was for the life I could have, the life we could build together. Back in Boulder, I threw myself into my work. The mineral company had its ups and downs, but my newfound clarity about my past fueled my ambition. I was no longer just a worker trying to make ends meet. I had something to prove, not just to the world, but to myself. I started leading a small team focused on environmental mining practices, which was a passion I had developed over the years. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was building something that would last, something that could change the future for the better. But even with everything moving forward, there was still a piece of the puzzle missing. Declan and Liam were still stuck in the same place I had been. I knew I couldn't abandon them. I promised them a better life, and I would make sure they had one, no matter what. I reached out to Declan first, who was attending school in Denver, studying engineering. He had made it out of the old house, but he still carried the weight of the past with him. "How are you doing?" I asked him on the phone one evening. "I'm doing okay," he replied. "But it's still hard, you know? Sometimes I feel like I'm stuck in that house all over again." I understood. I knew exactly what he meant. "You don't have to be stuck, Declan. I'm here. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." A week later, I found a place for him in Boulder, near Sarah and me. It wasn't much, but it was a fresh start. The move was hard for him, but it was what he needed. He was still learning how to stand on his own, but with every step he took, he was closer to the future I had promised him. As for Liam, he was still in Havenfield, but he was no longer a child. He had turned 18, and I knew he was ready for a new beginning. I spoke to him on the phone a few days later. "Liam, you don't have to stay there anymore," I told him. "Come to Boulder. You can stay with me and Declan. We'll figure it out together." Liam was hesitant, unsure, but I could hear the hope in his voice. "I'll think about it, Kieran." And just like that, the family I had once feared was starting to rebuild itself. Slowly, piece by piece, we were finding a way to start fresh, to leave the scars behind, and embrace the future. The weeks that followed were filled with small changes. Declan settled into Boulder quickly, enrolling at the local university, and finding his feet in the new city. I watched him grow more confident with each passing day, the weight of our old life slowly lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in years, I saw him laugh freely, without the constant shadow of Havenfield looming over him. It was a relief for me, but it also made me realize that, as much as I had tried to protect him, it wasn't enough. I wanted more for him, more than what our parents had ever been able to give. Liam, on the other hand, remained distant. I kept in touch with him, but each conversation felt more strained than the last. He hadn't left Havenfield yet. Part of me feared that he never would. After all, what was there to hold him to this new life I was offering? The memories of our childhood were still so fresh, and the small town that had trapped us was still the only place he knew. I tried to be patient, understanding that his decision would come when he was ready. In the meantime, I focused on the work that was slowly beginning to give me a sense of purpose outside of the rubble of my past. At the mineral company, I was becoming more involved in sustainable mining practices, pushing for changes in the way we sourced materials for the growing green energy sector. The work was important, and it kept my mind occupied, but it also made me realize just how much of my own healing still needed to be done. One evening, Sarah and I were sitting on the balcony of our apartment, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. The colors of the sky turned from orange to pink to a dusky purple. It was one of those perfect moments that seemed to pause time. But even in this serenity, I couldn't fully shake the feeling that I was still running away from something. "I've been thinking," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. "You've made so much progress, Kieran. You're here, you're with me. You're building a future." but I still see the weight of everything you went through in your eyes. It's like you're holding something back. I didn't say anything at first. What could I say? The weight of my past had followed me here, and no matter how far I ran from it, there were pieces of it that I couldn't leave behind. But Sarah was right, and deep down I knew that avoiding it wouldn't make it go away. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice hoarse. I've come so far, but it still feels like there's this part of me that's just stuck. Sarah turned to face me, her eyes soft but full of understanding. I think you know what you need to do, she said gently. You can't keep running forever, Kieran. You need to confront it. Confront them. I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right, of course. But could I really go back? Could I face my parents again after everything that had happened? I can't go back there, Sarah, I said, my voice tight. Not after everything they did. I know. But you don't have to go back as the boy who was hurt. You're not that person anymore. You're stronger than they ever gave you credit for. Her words echoed in my mind long after the evening had passed. She was right. I had built something here, with her, with Declan, and slowly, even with Liam. But there was still a part of me that needed closure. A part of me that needed to see them face the consequences of their actions, even if it wasn't for them, but for me. The following week, I made the decision. I called Declan first. I'm going back, I told him. I need to face them. I can't keep living like this, with the past hanging over me. There was silence on the other end, but I could hear the concern in Declan's voice when he spoke again. Are you sure you're ready for that, Kieran? I know what they did to you, to us. But do you think seeing them again will help? I don't know, I admitted. But I have to try. For me. Declan didn't argue. He understood, probably better than anyone. If you need me, I'm here. And so is Liam. We've got your back. I knew they did, even though Liam was still distant, still reluctant to leave Havenfield. But it wasn't just about them. It was about me taking that final step to reclaim my life. To let go of the pain that had defined me for so long. I packed my things that weekend and drove back to Havenfield. The roads were eerily quiet, the winter chill still hanging in the air. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my thoughts swirling with doubt and fear. I couldn't help but remember the boy I had been, the boy I thought I had left behind. Was I still that person, carrying all the hurt from the past? Or was I someone else now, someone who had the right to live on his own terms? When I arrived at the old house, nothing had changed. The paint on the porch was still chipped, the front yard a patch of dead grass. It was just as I remembered it, a place full of broken promises and too many memories. The weight of it all hit me like a wave as I walked up to the door. My father answered, his face craggy and worn from years of hard living. He looked at me with surprise, but there was no warmth in his eyes. Kieran, he said, his voice hoarse. What are you doing here? I came to talk, I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. He stepped aside and I walked into the house, the smell of stale alcohol lingering in the air. My mother was in the kitchen, not even looking up when I entered. She hadn't changed, and that realization hurt more than I expected. I sat down at the worn table, and for a moment no one said anything. It was like I was a stranger in my own home. I didn't know where to start, how to break the silence that had always existed between us. But I knew I had to speak the truth I had kept inside for far too long. You both destroyed my life, I said quietly. You took away my chance at happiness, at a future, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen anymore. My father sneered, but there was something more in his eyes, a kind of resignation that made my heart ache. You don't know what it was like for us, he muttered. I do, I said, my voice firm. But you didn't try. You chose the bottle over your children. You destroyed what we could have had, and I'm done pretending like it didn't matter. My mother didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at the floor. I felt the weight of the years pressing down on me, and in that moment, I realized that this was it. This was the closure I needed. I'm not your son anymore, I said. I don't owe you anything. The air in the room was thick with silence after I spoke those words. It wasn't the triumphant kind of silence, nor was it peaceful. It was the silence of everything unraveling, of years of resentment and pain finally surfacing. My father said nothing. He just looked at me, his eyes full of something I couldn't place. It wasn't anger, at least not the kind I was used to. It was a mixture of regret, shame, and maybe, just maybe, a small recognition of the truth. For the first time, he seemed to understand the depth of the damage he had caused. But I wasn't here for him to apologize. I wasn't here to hear excuses or justifications. I was here to close the door on a chapter of my life that had kept me trapped for so long. I had a family now. I had Nora, Declan, and Liam, and even if the past couldn't be erased, they were my future. They were the people who had made me believe in love again. They were the ones who had given me the strength to keep going. I've done everything for you two, I continued, my voice unwavering. But it's over. I'm done being the one who sacrifices. I'm done being the one who cleans up the mess. I've moved on. My mother, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke up. Her voice was low, almost fragile. You think it was easy for us too, Kieran? We didn't know how to do better. We didn't know how to be better. I stared at her for a long time, my mind racing. I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to scream, to make her understand how much I had needed her, how much I had wanted her to be the mother I had always dreamed of. But the years of neglect, of silence, of indifference, they had built a wall between us that could never be torn down by words. I don't know what you wanted from me, I said softly, my voice breaking a little. But I'm not the same boy you left behind. I've found my place in the world. I've built a family of my own. I've learned to love myself, and I've learned that I don't need your approval to do that. I stood up, feeling lighter somehow. Even as my heart ached with the finality of the moment, I knew I had made the right choice. The weight of my parents' expectations, their manipulations, their failures, it would no longer define me. Declan had been quiet the entire time, standing at the door, his arms crossed. He hadn't spoken, but I saw something in his eyes. It wasn't just the anger I expected. It was understanding, like he knew this was a step I needed to take. And maybe, just maybe, he needed it too. I turned to leave, but then I felt something pulling me back. It was Nora. She was sitting in the doorway, her eyes filled with concern. Her presence grounded me, just as it always did. She wheeled herself over to me, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to hold mine. You did the right thing, she said softly, her voice full of warmth. You freed yourself from them. I nodded, unable to speak. I had freed myself. But it wasn't just from them. It was from the life they had tried to force on me. I was no longer bound by their toxicity, by their demands, by their broken promises. The drive back to Boulder felt like a rebirth. I was leaving behind the ghosts of Havenfield. The bitter memories that had once shaped me, the people who had once held me captive, were now far behind me. Nora and I didn't speak much during the drive. She didn't need to say anything, and neither did I. The weight that had settled over me all these years had lifted, and for the first time, I felt free. It was as if I had been carrying a burden that I hadn't even realized was there until it was gone. When we finally arrived at our home, I felt a deep sense of peace. The house was quiet, welcoming, and full of the life we had built together. It was the home I had always wanted, and now it was mine to cherish. The next few days were spent settling back into our routine. I kept in touch with Declan and Liam, helping them as much as I could, though I knew they were starting to forge their own paths. I could finally offer them a life without the darkness of Havenfield hovering over them. I also spoke to Sarah. Her reappearance in my life had shaken me, but I had come to terms with what had happened. She was a part of my past, but she wasn't the person I was anymore. I had learned that love couldn't be bought, nor could it be manipulated. What Sarah and I had was beautiful, but it was over. I didn't need her to validate my worth. In the weeks that followed, Nora and I began to dream bigger. We talked about starting a family, about traveling the world, about doing things that would bring us joy. The possibility of a future without fear or regret was intoxicating. I also focused on the work that had brought me so much fulfillment, the sustainable mining projects, the new research initiatives, and the promise I had made to myself and my siblings to create a better future for us all. We continued our charitable foundation, now with even more passion. We helped more kids escape the same toxic environment I had grown up in, providing them with the opportunities they deserved. The letters we received from kids we had helped brought so much meaning to our lives. It reminded me that every step I had taken, every decision I had made, had led me to this point. As I sat at the kitchen table one night watching Nora read her latest book on astrophysics, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. The journey had been long, full of pain and heartache, but I had finally found my way. And for the first time in my life, I believed that the best was yet to come.